questions about rhythm in relation to your composition and the ways you thought about it.
Okay.
So I wanted to start by asking you about some of your early musical training and to find out if there's any particular emphasis on rhythm. I know you studied drums, but
yeah,
how did this interest in rhythm begin?
Well, it probably began when I was born in some gene in the body somewhere that, you know, that we all, that you and I and a whole lot of other people share, that people will probably find out about it sometime. So the answer is who knows. But I took piano lessons when I was a kid, like, you know, John Thompson, simplified classic type things, and it made very little impact on me. I guess I heard, you know, what I always called middle class favorites when I was a kid. Beethoven Fifth and Schubert Unfinished and Overture to Meistersinger on Broadway shows, Bing Crosby. Remember those days? And I never heard any music before 1750 or any music after Wagner and any jazz until I was 14. And that was really the big sort of revelation at 14. I had a friend who said, hey, you got to hear this, and he played for me about the spring. And later I heard the Fifth Brandenburg. And not through him, but through another friend, I heard one of those old recordings of Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and one of the drummers, Kenny Clark. And they just absolutely grabbed my ear. And the second friend who played in the jazz record was a pianist, and he said, you got to be the drummer. And I thought that was fine. And so I started studying with Roland Koloff, who was in those days known as Butch. Here was Butch Koloff, who played with glow-in-the-dark sticks at the local movie theater, all the G. Cooper solos. That was a typical 50s, this is 1950. And I started with him, and he gave me like 2 books, I remember. He gave me the Haskell Hart book, which of course you know, and he also gave me the stick control book. And he stressed that, the stick control thing, and I found it really interesting. Basically just alternating eighth notes, but constantly breaking up the hand distribution. And I didn't know why, but I just thought, geez, that's interesting, you know. And that just sort of stuck in my head. And I think probably that was maybe one of the first things that actually, I wouldn't even know at the time, but kind of pointed me where later on it would really get interesting. At the time, I used to go down to Birdland, which is like, you know, I had to sit with the didn't serve the drinks, and I remember seeing Kenny Clark, who was my idol. And why he was my idol was that he just played, basically plays, you probably know, he really just played ride cymbal and a few, you know, kick drum, and bass drum in those days, accents, which they called, they used to call him Kluk, I think, because of the sound of Kluk, yeah, Kenny Clark, Kluk. Probably because of this, you know, these unusual accents. But what was really magic about him was not the technique, but the actual feeling of the way he played, where this entire, you know, Miles Davis would sort of float in a quality of sound you don't find even in Bach, which is like, you know, the most incredibly rhythmically satisfying Western music. This was a unique, you know, quality, and I wanted to be Kenny Clark. never did make it.
Well, that's good. You answered my second question, which was what was it about the time feel of Kenny Clark?
Yeah, I mean, Max Roach, who's still with us, Kenny Clark passed away several years ago, it's in Paris, was a much greater technician, you know, could play more stuff, and did play more stuff, and certainly was an inventive musician, but he never had the feeling of magic time, or whatever you want to say, that Kenny Clark had with this just incredibly. Of course, it might have helped that he was playing with Percy Heath and Horace Silver, which was like, you know, kind of like the ultimate, seemed like the ultimate rhythm section to me. But it was that simplicity and that the quality of doing something which was, in a sense, a jazz cliche, you know, totally, absolutely straight down the middle, you know, jazz ride cymbal beat, nothing to write home about, but nobody to play it that way.
I guess that's one of the big questions about rhythm and time is what is that feeling about time? What is it?
Well, it's getting it right, which would show up on an oscilloscope as wrong. You know, when I do those computer, you know, mock-ups of the pieces that I send around, you know, they're very useful, but they lack that magic, even though and they're dead on, and a lot of very good players lack that magic because they're very concentrated on being right. I think that what I'm talking about happens in music in general, and you certainly probably have it in Nexus, is when you know something so well that you're not reading it, and you're not only just playing, you're playing it after a period of time until it's just sunk into you, and you're expressing it exactly the way your body and mind tells you to express it. So I think you have to get to a very high level of competence, even if it's just a little, ding, 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 But that has to be just sort of, it's an automatic, unthought about kind of performance level, which means that, tons of other stuff has to happen before you get to that. But once you get there, then some people have that quality, and others just don't have it. And I'm sure if you put electrodes on everybody's head and all over their body, you probably find a reason why. But
that's what it seems to boil down to.
Yeah.
Great. You've talked a lot about going to Ghana was confirmation of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What exactly were the ideas that going there confirmed?
Well, I went there in 1970, as you remember, because we talked about shots and pieces in 1971. When I went there, the reigning musical aesthetic in the new music world, as you probably remember, was called live electronics. Stockhausen was operating with banks of equipment in real time. It means, i.e., he's in a concert hall twisting dials. John Cage was doing the same thing with David Tudor, making electronic pieces happen in front of an audience by manipulating this, that, and the other thing. And I was thinking, as a matter of fact, people, I forget, maybe it was Varese or somebody said percussion led to electronics. The idea of non-pitched sound led to the use of noises and whatnot. And then I kept thinking, well, it's going to go in and come out the other end too. Percussion's going to keep on going. And I guess the confirmation in Ghana was like two things. One, these ideas of phasing that I had before I went there, piano based, violin based, were way before I went to Ghana, are not what we do, but they're real related to what we do. And there's an old tradition of this kind of rhythmic counterpoint here, and of course later on in Bali too. I mean, later on for me discovering it in Bali too. And even more importantly, percussion and the music generated with percussion as the dominant voice, as opposed to the Western orchestra with strings as the dominant voice. There's a tradition for that. You're not all by yourself. Go. Both in terms of the structure of the music, the counterpoint structure of the music, and the instrumentation of the music. This is a solid, well-trodden path, and there's a path, and there's got to be a future.
Sure. What do you think it is? The Ogbe bell pattern, that boom, ba 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 ba.
Yeah, the gundown pattern. Yeah.
What do you think is so compelling about that? It's used
by
the Africans so much, and of course in your music a lot.
Well, I got it. Yeah.
And other people. I mean, it's used a lot.
Because it's so ambiguous. I mean, especially what happens is, when the players get going, they stop playing the low bell. And they just ring out on the high bell and they ride. It's like a ride cymbal pattern. Dum, 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 dum. I mean, where's one? I don't know. After a while, you don't know. So all you know is it's the ambiguity.
Yeah.
12 is 12. Everybody talks about 12 tone music. 12 is magic. 12 is really a magic number in music. And you were reminding me of that, recently. Because, the basic ambiguity is whether it's, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But there's, it could be 2s, it could be 6s, it could be 5s and 7s. And it divides up, so it lends itself to division more than anything else we have. And that's why it's hard to know how to write it out. 12/8 equals 3/2 equals 6/4, because they're all possibly present.
So while we're on the topic of African music, what about the other non-Western music? Balinese, of course, has influenced you a lot. What were the ways that you used structures or ideas, rhythmic ideas, particularly in Balinese?
Well, I really didn't. I mean, again, everything was pretty much in place. I think. I don't think anything at any point. I never took any Balinese interlocking patterns. And their music, in a sense, is much simpler rhythmically than, it's basically subdivisions. One guy's playing 16th, one guy's playing 8th, one guy's playing
30 based on
8/32, and then one guy plays a big gong every 64 beats.
Yeah.
And that's great. I guess what interested me mostly was these interlocking patterns, the Kodakan things, where one player would play against another player, which was certainly, not how I did it, but the same thing with different rhythms. And that's different than African stuff is really basically interlocking different patterns. In the Kodakan, sometimes you get something that's, one guy's filling in rests or overlapping. It's not what I do, it's not, canonic, but it's closer. And I guess this is, any music that is that rhythmically charged was just, the Japanese gamelan is a whole different feel. It's much slower, much more based on quote harmony, I guess, given or notes rather than timbres rather than Balinese music is really with that rhythmic energy. Doesn't mean anything. And I think another thing that interested me about it was how the drummers in the Samara Pegalinga and I guess in any of the big gamelans control the tempo as playing conductors. And that definitely influenced, along with the idea of the master drummer calling out changing patterns in West African music, the idea of the vibraphone in music for 18.
Right? Yeah, that's the most obvious.
Yeah,
absolutely. So you never seem to have been attracted to Indian music.
Well, I admired it, but I don't know what it was. I mean, I admired it. Maybe it's because basically Indian music is the monophone, is the soloist and the accompaniment, and both of them are
fabulous.
But I never, somehow, I wasn't much of a soloist for sure, and I didn't even know how to. Now that people approach me for solo pieces, and I give them instead a piece instead of a flute piece, I give them a piece for 8 flutes, and they play one and record the other 7. And that's worked out real well. But if somebody said today, you got to write a solo piece, I'd say, I don't know where to start.
So, when you were composing drumming, did you conceive of the whole piece initially, or did it kind of evolve as you went along?
No, I don't know. I'm kind of. I know when I was a student at Juilliard, there was this a black student drummer by the name of Bobby Thomas. I don't know what became of him. And we had these, lunchtime concerts, Hurley had them at Curtis too. And one lunchtime concert, he did a percussion thing where he had stand-mounted bongos he played with sticks. And I probably told you this story years ago.
I haven't heard this one.
And I don't remember what he played, but I remember that the sticks on the bongos were like, wow, that's fantastic. Because it was so pitched, so loud, so clear. I thought, gee, I'd love to do something with that. And then I just completely forgot about it. That must have been like in 1959 or 60. And then somehow, when I got an idea of dealing with tuned drums, I suddenly began thinking about, that you could do this with bongos that we stand around and play with sticks. And when that piece got done, I don't remember what it was that made me go on to the marimbas. I don't remember whether I just thought, well, this is middle register and it would fit on the marimba, or whether somebody said something. I mean, I don't know. Well, no, you hadn't really, you didn't come in the group until later on, because I was doing the bongos with Art Murphy and...
I think when I came in, you
already had the marimbas.
You were just starting the marimbas. I don't know whether you completed it. Because,
just started the marimbas.
Every week I would come in and...
Right. A little bit more. Next chapter. But the marimbas already there.
Conceived of the whole structure of the 4 sections.
No, I certainly didn't think of it at the beginning. Absolutely not, no. I think I just had the bongos in mind. And somehow or other, it became, a possibility that maybe it was the soft sticks in drumming. The sound of the soft sticks in drumming suggests a mallet percussion instrument, which I hadn't used up to that point. And then, as you know, I got those little 3-octave student marimbas.
Right.
And then, when the marimba thing got done and it got to the top, it still didn't seem like an ending. And I liked the idea of taking away the low notes. I think that was after 4 organs. See, 4 organs was a piece where there was this big chord, and the way you got motion to stay within the same chord was to release the dominant 11th chord, to take away the root of the chord, and then successive other notes that you were left with just the higher notes, which were kind of resolution. And then build the dominant back up against. So it's kind of like the longest 5/1 cadence in Western music. But the idea was interesting, because usually what happens is you build up something on the bottom and you add on top, especially in jazz, and it's a little bit more predictable that way, because once you've got the bottom notes, then you tend to work, unless you're doing non-tonal music, you tend to work in even if you're not just in thirds, you're in some tonal relationship to what you've got on the bottom. If you take the bottom away, it's a whole different story. then things get more and more ambiguous, and you wonder now where on earth are we going? You know, it was very clear, and now it's not very clear anymore. So the time you got to the top of the marimba, somehow it seemed to be, wow, it'd be interesting now to go up, and then I was aware that there was this glockenspiel, and that we basically reached the bottom of the glockenspiel on the top of this particular marimba. And sure enough, that's the way it was. So then the idea came, okay, let's pass the baton over to the glocks. And also, I guess by that time I began to realize that here was this piece with one pattern that was just changing notes and changing timbre after half an hour or 20 minutes or something like that. So then there were these three timbres. And then I do very clearly remember that when I got into the glockenspiel piece, some ways I began thinking, I'm going to have to write a finale, an old-style Western finale. I got all this stuff in front of me, and I'm just, I invited all these people to dinner, now I got to serve dinner. So it was very much it was at the end a realization of a Western, particularly Western obligation to put together these ingredients that I had dealt with independently. And I think in a way that really, the moving forward drumming is really the beginning of kind of moving back into Western thinking.
Yeah, so it's definitely a Western form.
Yeah.
Pressure or
exactly.
Thinking.
Exactly. And then after that came, music from Mallet instruments, where I started using, from the very beginning of the piece, an ensemble of different instruments, because everything up to then had been multiples of the same instrument, 4 organs, 4 violins, 2 pianos, etc.
Before we leave drumming, the signature rhythm of drumming.
Right.
How did you get the idea for that rhythm?
Again, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't. I'm trying to think. At that point, I knew the African bell pattern, so it might have been related to that. I think I remember being, literally being on a speakerphone, a telephone, so just drumming my fingers and it happening. It was not. It might have had something to do with the way the hands work in piano phase, where you've got,
Right.
But I mean, I don't remember, working it out. I remember working out the notes, as it goes along for sure. But the rhythm itself, I think, just was one of those things. Just came. And I like, the symmetry of it was very attractive, and the fact that the right hand was so completely divorced rhythmically from the left hand, and therefore that by using the right notes, that would just emerge as it does over and over again as a counter rhythm.
Does the fact that you're left-handed come into play?
Huge. Absolutely huge, yeah.
In that piece?
In drumming, everything's a left hand. Every part is a left hand lead part. Right. That's why I can only stand on certain sides of the drums.
That's the choreography.
Yeah, at least that part of the piece, right.
Yeah. Well, back to form. When you're thinking of form of pieces after drumming, do you think in terms of larger rhythmic form? People talk about harmonic rhythm or structural rhythm.
Right.
Sense. Do you
actually not. To tell you the truth, after drumming, before drumming, and maybe up to clapping music, I've actually got a notebook somewhere which was graph paper. It was the only, my notebooks are all regular notation. And I had one, I think I bought the notebook when we were in Europe, in one fancy stationery store or something. And it's just graph paper, and I guess I kind of knew about the terminology we're using that stuff. But I use it because you could just dot out things rhythmic-wise, and it was just like to sync rhythmically. Using graph paper to like space things out and look at them that way, which is different than looking at them. You can approximate it, but it's built for that. You don't have to specify any pitches at all.
A lot of people notate African drumming that way, just to see the
right.
relationships without having the
without having the overlay of any meter.
Western notation.
Exactly.
Concept.
So, but I don't remember anything specifically. I'd have to look at it. I don't remember anything specifically that came out of using that. I just remember having such a notebook. After drumming, basically, 6 pianos, clapping music was the next thing, and that came from the deep thoughts that come from going and having drinks at a third-rate flamenco nightclub outside of Brussels. Exactly. People they have all these thoughts about how drumming. I said, you want to really hear how clapping music began? Okay. And the funny thing is, when I was in Holland recently, 2 girls did clapping music, and they did it like, back to back like this. I said, you don't know how right you are. And they kept looking at the audience while they did it. It was very theatrical. I said, all you needed was like red tops and stiletto heels, and you'd be there 100%.
Well, what about the rhythm for clapping music? Where did that come from? That's another one.
Yeah,
That's
that's
actually your real signature rhythm.
Well, it's just a variation on the bump drum pattern, on the African pattern. It's very close. You got dun, 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 dun. It's also interesting because it's 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, cyclical that way. I think that's undoubtedly what we made.
That's another one that just kind of occurred to you?
Yeah.
It wasn't a thought out.
No, I didn't think 3, 2. I think that might have, who knows, that might have been in the I'd have to go back and look at the notebook. That might very well have been in the graph paper notebook, which was about 71, 72 when Clapton used the cat in that pattern. Yeah, that pattern turned out to be really, I wonder why I didn't. I guess I didn't, self-consciously didn't want to use the African pattern at that point.
Yeah,
I wanted to pick up my own variations on it. And drumming was in that thing. Piano phase had been in 12, violin phase was in 12. So obviously I was in that turn of mind, and the African thing again just, really endorsed it. So I think probably it was that I wanted to do something that came out of the African drum pattern, but that was my own stamp on it. And then this 3, 2, 1, 2, thing occurred. It's interesting.
In your counterpoint pieces, the Vermont and New York, they're sectionalized.
Yeah, fast, slow, fast. Remember that?
I just wondered how you decided on the structure, kind of the rhythmic structure of those sections of those pieces.
Well, there's no. Basically, after drumming, I never think just purely rhythmically. I just always thought there's always a module, a melodic pattern. Melodic pattern, like that, the beginning of Vermont Counterpoint was that. In Electric Counterpoint, it actually came out of Simshar Rome's book on Central African polyphony. He was putting together a couple of horn parts. No, on the guitar piece, Electric Counterpoint. It's like two different patterns in a Central African piece that he wrote out and then showed how they added up to something, and I sort of took slight variation on that and came out. It's the only time I actually took something from an African melodic pattern, and it's the least African sounding of any piece that I wrote. And New York Counterpoint was also just the setting. Actually, in New York Counterpoint and in Electric Counterpoint, the pulse sections, like in Music for 18, it was harmonically laid out first. Basically, from Music for 18 musicians on, a whole load of pieces started with a harmonic series, like Desert Music, Big Time, Sextet, which is very close to Desert Music in terms of what the harmonies actually are. New York Counterpoint, Electric Counterpoint, 4 sections, the recent cello piece, even City Life. Sometimes it's looser, sometimes it's tighter, but there was something always there. And six pianos was just like literally noodling around the piano, coming up with a hand pattern. But not rhythmically conceived, because as a matter of fact, what's interesting about six pianos is that it's in 4/4, which is really kind of, I always thought was kind of a no-no. That's the one that's going to really get bogged down. So the fact that it worked, I felt real good about 6 pianos in the sense that rhythmically it was interesting, even though it was in 4/4.
How do you decide on the meter for your compositions?
Well, again, there was that long period of time when a lot of pieces were in this kind of all-purpose 12 something or other. And 6 pianos, again, spontaneously because of just the hand pattern that I came up with, was a 4/4 piece. Music for mallet instruments is, I think, because there's 2 for it. It goes from a 3 into a 2, which is kind of nice, and then back in the 3s. So.
Is it intuitive, basically?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, boy.
Should I put that a capital I there?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, when I read the book, I mean, in the preface, I said basically everything. You got the new one. Yeah. Everything ultimately. I mean, there are lots of there's a lot of physics in music, and which most people are unaware of, and so therefore that can't be the basis of anything in terms of your ear. And you hear a lot of things, and everybody hears a lot of things in their life, and wherever you go is based on something that ultimately you just to say, well, look, I'm not really. I learned, you learn a lot of things in music, and they are conscious, so they have to be, and if they're not, then you're the loser for not having that education. But nobody can have enough technique or enough education, and yet everybody, muddles through at whatever level they're on. But musical intuition seems to me to be the real nitty-gritty, and that's just something that people, it's something they're probably born with, and it certainly can develop. But that's really at the root of what they're going to do, and they may not even, I don't think we are really aware of it. But after a while, you begin to sort of say, "Oh, I keep doing this kind of stuff." Or in terms of, I believe, some people have argued with this, I believe that there's a big difference it's a huge difference between a piece like Piano Phase and a piece like Talim and a piece, well, even like the desert music or a proverb or what have you. So I very often wanted to sort of push the envelope just because I get bored with
Sure.
what I'm doing, or a text will push me in some direction, so I like that. But I realize, especially now in my 60s, that that there are a lot of things that sometimes it's nice to say, I'm going to do, like this piece I'm working on now, it basically went back to, well, let's just do something with, pulse on the pianos, and then as a result of doing that, something brand new happened. Sort of like polytonal things started to happen in the middle of this piece. But my basic thought was, let's just kind of like relax. And I was kind of pushing myself with this cello piece that I was writing for my advisor. And it's good, but it's like real kind of like, screwed it down real tight. And I just thought, okay, let's just do something that's like, pleasant and easy to do and see where it goes. And the fact that it didn't go, where any of those older pieces went at all. It started off sounding, oh, it's in that bag, and then all of a sudden it's this big change.
So, I guess back to intuition, when you're doing substituting beats for rests in these pieces,
right.
Is that all intuitive, or is
Absolutely.
there a formula? There's no formula for
No.
that?
Well, in musical pieces of wood, once I did the first one, I think I began to, I think the other ones followed suit, because I noticed it was an interesting order. And one of the sort of, one of the rules of thumb was to try to avoid putting in the downbeat until near the end, or actually at the end, the new downbeat of their displaced pattern, so that the ambiguity would be heightened and then nailed down, and somebody else would come up with still another conflicting rhythm with their build-up. So that, but again, that's a rule of thumb. In other words, if it really sounded good to bring in a downbeat, okay, then we'll bring in a downbeat.
You just try one, listen to it, and
basically the way I was working was by overdubbing on tape in those days, and the basic pattern we played, and then I'd have the other quality, and I knew what I try to figure out is where am I going. In other words, where is this? Where is the canon going to end up? Is it 1/8 away? Is it 2/8 away? And I just do that by trial and error. I mean, certain things were interesting. Always being 3/8 away was always an interesting thing to start with. But sometimes 2 is good, and some occasionally. Anyway, I would just try to ascertain it. Then once I had that figured out, where am I going? That's what we're building up to. Okay, now where's the most interesting place to start that displaced pattern? And then what's the most interesting next edition? And again, a lot of it will be trial and error. And then sometimes and then you begin to hear the way it go too. So then that actually, that's still that way of working. I mean, not that precise pattern of build-up, although I still occasionally use them. It's still the case today, even though I'm with a computer. It's very much try to play it back and see how it's going.
So you mentioned canons. Of course, canons you use for years and years. Does that stem from the phasing thing, the tape loops and all that?
Well, it all goes back to my first composition teacher, Hall Overton, who was, when I got out of Cornell, I was studying with this guy, William Austin, who was a musicologist, and he, I don't know how, said, I know, okay, you're going to New York, I think you ought to look up this guy, Hall Overton, because he's a good composer. He studied with Vincent Perceptual, and he's really a great jazz musician, and he knew, where I was at, so I think you'd really like him. And I went down to New York, and I went to his place, and I met him, and I, told him where I was at, and I was just getting started, and he was fine, and one of the things that he threw at me right away was the Microcosmos, Bartok, we've got volume 1. And he gave me assignments like, okay, write a melody that just goes all the way up, all the way down. Write a melody that goes up halfway and down. Really, dumb but brilliant assignments. And then he gave me the Microcosmos. And the Microcosmos gives you, a few just like, you play in octaves and you play in fifths, and then finally you start playing some canons. And you also use the modes. So basically, in that book, what I picked up was most of the Dorian Phrygian modes and the other modes, and the idea, canon, free canon, canon. It wasn't canon, exact canon, inexact canon. And I found that really interesting. And the phase thing, which was an entirely later and somewhat just by chance thing, of the tape loops starting together, drifting out of phase. Pretty quickly, I realized, hey, this is just a funny way of doing a canon on a really short thing, and that made me feel a lot better about it because canon is a real old idea in the West, and this was basically just a kind of new take on a basically very good sound idea. And then the real problem with the phase pieces was, well, okay, it's fine on tape, but how do you do this live? And at first it seemed impossible.
So you mentioned this ambiguity interest in
Right.
rhythms. That brings up the whole area of perception of rhythms.
Right.
Perception.
Right.
In your pieces, your rhythms can be perceived in multiple ways.
Right.
Generally, how do you achieve this perceptual ambiguity in your music?
Well, like you said, one of the things is we've already been talking about. One of them is that in the metrical world of divisions of 12, this is most likely to happen, and the African music is a kind of model of how that was achieved there. But again, in 6 pianos, you can hear a lot of things going on and not know where things are happening.
You take it beyond that.
Yeah.
It's become your special.
And when you get into canons, so what are you doing? What you're doing in a strict canon is you've got some piece of in my music it's melodic material. It could be in the noises. It could be recordings of any politician. It could be anything. But in my music, it tends to be melodic pattern. Sometimes in Italian, it's real canons. It's melodies. But when you get them going, and if you get them going in what they used to call in the Baroque period, stretto, where they're kind of tightly spaced, and they're not too long, then as you listen to it, you find your mind is invited to wander. It's a natural human thing to do that because the music is set up that way. In other words, it's not just that, I happen to hear it, but nobody else does, or you and I do, but it's really just if you have especially a pattern that's a bar or two or 3 or 4 long, and you have that same bar going against itself in, let's say, 3 or more voices particularly, then what you hear will probably depend on a lot of things. Part of it will depend on what are the lowest notes. Those will begin to sort of separate out. What are the highest notes? Obviously, what are the notes in the middle? And then unaccountable things that may have to do with where you're sitting in the hall, what your intuitive melodic things are. In the speech pieces where there were someone was speaking like Brother Walter in It's Gonna Rain or Daniel Hammond in Come Out, words are being repeated over and over again, and all these phonemes are being put on top of each other. So when people hear them, they sometimes hear other words. I mean, I remember having the piece played once, and the guy came up to me later and said, "I heard your piece, It's Gonna Rain, and it says Black Rhino, Black Rhino." I said, "Yeah, well, for you it said Black Rhino, Black Rhino." So, I mean, it's funny, but it's also just, in other words, if you set up a situation where all this stuff is going on, then it's possible to accurately hear. And as a matter of fact, as you know, as well as I do, that in some of the pieces, like in drumming and in music for mallet instruments, and way up even into later on pieces, it's actually in the 4 sections too. When you get a field of these things, some of the other players can start playing some of these patterns that are in this contrapuntal web, and actually wrote them out. It's the whole sum of, if you've got 3 people playing marimbas, then write out all 3 parts on one staff, so we can say, all this is actually what's going on. And that's how originally, Jay Clayton and Joan LaBarbera and Judy Sherman and I worked on the vocal patterns for the 2nd section of drumming. We used to have tape loops of these things going over and over again, just sitting there, and somebody would start singing something. And we said, and there'd be a pause, and somebody said, hey, I went down. And then, okay, now let's make up duets with that. So it's like looking at, like something like this, and saying, well, your eye can kind of get lost in the symmetry of this pattern. basically it's just I guess it's sort of like, you know, ovals of the same material, but because the material is it's all the same material, but there's slight variations in the quality of the sisal or whatever, you know, whatever grass this mat is, and also in performance of pieces like drumming and whatnot, when people are playing it, like you and Bob used to get into these accent things when you're doing the phasing, and so you try to feed people certain patterns that you thought were interesting, even when somebody else was playing other patterns they thought were interesting. And I used to sometimes say things, but I enjoyed that, and I noticed actually just in Holland now, you know, kids get off on that, you know, right now. So it seems that that's just that performance, that the exact performance you're hearing, or the exact recording you're hearing, or the room that you're in, all of these things which affect music in general affect that as well. You'll hear certain overtones and just sort of be standing in the room because of the size of the room.
Sure. So you were talking about these melodies and creating the melodic fragments for drumming. Does melody basically emerge from rhythm for you? Is your concept?
Well, it did in drumming. It certainly did in drumming, but in general, and it did, I guess, once I got onto that, you know, that pattern from clapping music, then I guess music for 18, I kind of like began singing that and improvising with that at the keyboard to come up with stuff where I kind of just kept that rhythm and then changed the notes, which was still kind of coming out of drumming. Okay, we know what the rhythm is. Let's see how the notes can go to it. I think after music for 18, that pretty much went away. I mean, then this became like, you know, like octets in 5, you know, right? And it was a whole different break. But again, it got pretty ambiguous because of the almost sounds like boogie woogie and 2 pianos. Yeah. It's kind of weird.
Something like Tehalim and melodies and Tehalim.
Well, Tehalim is a real. Tehalim is a new rhythmic discovery. Tehalim, it opens up a new chapter again, totally unforeseen, absolutely. Now, I would say, and maybe for people listening, what we're talking about, or we know, they don't know, is that when I was writing Tehalim, which is basically the Hebrew word for the Psalms, means praises, comes from the same root as hallelujah. Is when I set the first text, Hashemayim Asaprim Kavod Kale, the heavens declare the glory of God, I began to hear, like composers, you look at the words, and then a melody goes on in your head, which has been happening since probably people have been on the planet. So Hashemayim Asaprim Kavod Kale comes to my ear, but at the same time comes 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1. I thought, what's that? Well, probably what that is in terms of my personal background, is the Bulgarian rhythms in Bartok, in a lot of his music with the Chin-Chin and Stravinsky, just right. The 2 composers who most fed us very fast changing meters that I had heard, and that a lot of people around me had heard. That undoubtedly, if I hadn't heard that, who knows if I would have heard this in my head. That probably, opened some synapses in my brain way back when I first heard that stuff. But nevertheless, it was for me a whole new thing, and it seemed, I assumed that it was the nature of biblical Hebrew that was forcing me into this. But I thought, well, it's kind of great, this is a whole different thing. So instead of there being like a 3 meter or 4 meter, it was like every bar was new. But basically what it got down to was 3s and 2s strung together in about 4 or 5 different ways. Also in Tehalim you get into weird meters. Basically you can break it down 7/8, 5/8, 6/8, and 2/4. Pretty much cover everything. But unfortunately it's in these huge bars up to 28 because I got hung up in trying to notate it the way the melody actually went. And it pushes conductors and the string players who have to descend there counting these 3s and 2s. But no one's actually said, hey, you really ought to rebar it, like rebarring the right strings, we rebar the right string. But they say rebar Tehalim and make it easier to play. I mean, maybe it would. I just didn't.
I don't think people realize. I don't really pay attention to the barring anyway. You just read the groupings.
Exactly. Well, for percussion, it's easy for always playing. I think the strings have a hard time because they're just sustaining and they've got to really, when is the downbeat going to come?
Like back before organs or something. I think those long.
Yeah. And they were hard, but they didn't make any. There was no subdivisions there. They were just arbitrary subdivisions that I had put in by ear, but they didn't correspond to. It's either 3 or 2. when Michael Tilson Thomas first saw Tahlene, he looked at me and said, "Musicians like downbeats."
I don't hear him saying that. Speaking of threes and twos, do you think all rhythms can be broken down into groupings of threes and twos?
I never thought about it, but I guess.
Theoretically.
Gosh, I'd have to go through an awful lot of music before I could say something like that. It sounds like something that would basically be true. I mean, basically, most pieces will break down to, you know, a lot of twos. You know, it's either duple or triple meter. We're certainly aware of that. So I guess, you know, given that you learn that in music school, that, you know, there's basically two families of meters, which are either duple or triple. I think I tend to buy that, and then you have these mixed meters like fives and sevens, which are multiples of smaller threes and twos. You never think of one as a viable unit unless it's really just one and a rest, and then it's really a two.
Right. I've asked people, Indian drummers, for example, if they actually feel fives, groups of fives, or do they feel that divided into twos and threes?
What are they saying?
You know, they've done it for so long.
They don't even know anymore.
They don't even know anymore. They, in a sense.
But how is their solfege? Does the solfege work that way?
No, generally it's twos and threes. Takita, you know.
Takita. So there you go.
It is divided two and three.
So there.
But then, they start thinking of it as five, but really it's
no. But if the solfege for them is so built into the drumming that I think that answers your question.
Yeah.
I think I think that's probably true. I mean, now that we've got confirmation from the subcontinent now, it's a perfect word. It's all for these intuits.
Well, when you're thinking about your rhythms, do you always think of them against a pulse?
Yeah, I do. I mean, that's where Four Organs was a really interesting piece, because just all you had was a pulse, and then you really were slicing, you know, different slices of pie, which I don't know. I guess in Four Organs you could probably subdivide even those sustained things into threes and twos, but I wasn't thinking about it. I was really counting out the full numbers. But yeah, I mean, I think probably what separates. As I get older, I realize. I mean, there are exceptions. I love the music of Arvo Pärt. You can't tap your foot to Arvo Pärt, but I just love what he's doing. Although he's, you know, I think actually you know, it's all. I don't think there's a great deal of vibrato. There's a lot of changing meters and particular scores. But it doesn't give you that. There's no rhythmic thrust to the music. It's just it's really more like, you know, chant. We're going to chant that what I do. But for me, yeah, there's definitely there's a grid going on. There's a pulse going on, and that's the lifeblood. And that's what I personally really I can't do. That's a must.
Well, I'm beginning to think that the real interest in rhythms per se is how they fit against a pulse.
Exactly.
If there's an rhythm abstractly played in space,
right,
it's virtually uninteresting unless it's against either another rhythm,
right,
or a pulse.
Right, or the pulse can be implied.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, if you ask Africans, I mean, when I ask, you know, Gideon or any of the people I studied with, you know, about anything like that, I mean, they just look at me blank, and it's just, it's the pattern, you know. Wait again. That's it. You know, you did it right, you did it wrong. You did it right. Let's do the next one. But I think that, you know, you could fairly say that, you know, that it's inconceivable that, because people clap their hands too. Old people who will start clapping spontaneously. So yeah, I guess that's why I have a very hard time really having any emotional connection with German, you know, especially later German romantic music from, you know, Brahms on, because that's really built on this idea of human gesture, which I just find, you know, I mean, these people are, you know, great composers, and I'm not trying to imply that they're not. They are, but the assumptions about the music rhythmically are really that there is no, you know, grid of pulse. It's more, the meters are a guide to, you know, how you interpret it, but no orchestra can play without a conductor. And that kind of music is something I have a very hard time identifying with because of that. And players who play that kind of music tend to have a very hard time with it. Really just can't play it.
Why do you think that we feel music in 8-bar phrases?
Well, you could feel the twos and fours.
Yeah. Some groupings like that, rather than, you know, odd numbers.
Well, it's interesting, because I was just working on this piece I'm working on now, and I realized I was in a lot of 2-bar phrases, and I thought I was going to constantly make 3-bar phrases. And I did, and it worked real good. It was great. It was a good shot of energy. I guess, you know, there's so much music that usually, you know, I mean, almost anywhere in the Western musical literature, and you get, you know, 2-bar phrases, 4-bar phrases.
But
How you doing?
why did that start? I mean,
God knows.
Anybody who ever asked that said, well, you know, we've always had that, but I mean, we haven't always had that. It started somewhere.
Well, I don't know if it was. I mean, you'd have to know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like in Indian music, it's basically 3s and 2s, okay? Or is it? I mean,
Well, the most common cycles are 16 and 8, you know. And
Right.
There's combinations within that, but still.
The overall
the
cycle.
common thing is 4s, 2s, 8s, 16s.
And then Balinese
No,
music is
no,
all
it's
that
all
way, and
that.
African music is basically 12.
So it's like that, you know,
Yeah.
except if you're talking about the Bulgarian or some of these Middle Eastern kinds of things.
But again, there's going to be 3s and 2s.
There's 3s and 2s, yeah. There's not such a solid base of 8 unless the 3s and 2s are grouped in larger groupings of
Right.
of that 8 or
Right.
or even numbered phrase.
I'd have to go look at Bartok transcriptions of Serbo-Croatian folk songs to see about whether that's the case or not. I'm trying to remember. I have to go look at his music again. That'd be an interesting place to look. But my hunch is there that I think we find it interesting when you break out of that, but that's the norm. That's the norm, and again, it's one of those things that just seems to be, you know, we have 2 eyes, we have 2 nostrils, we have 1 mouth, we have 2 ears, we write in 4s and 6s and 16.
That's exactly what I need. Is it just